In the heart of an unforgiving desert stands a ruined church, its adobe walls worn by the sun and by history. It is not a castle, nor a fortress, but a simple mission turned into the last bastion of an idea. Inside, a handful of men, fewer than 200, a strange brotherhood of settlers, adventurers, idealists, and living legends, prepare for annihilation. Outside, stretching to the horizon, lies the largest and most professional army in North America, a tide of 5,000 soldiers led by a dictator who calls himself the Napoleon of the West. His order, conveyed by a blood-red flag flying over the field, is simple, brutal, and absolute. No mercy, no surrender, no prisoners. This is not the chronicle of how a fortress fell. The Alamo was doomed from the start, a tactical mistake, an indefensible position. This is the story of why. It is the saga of how 200 men, facing certain death, made a deliberate choice. They did not choose to fight for survival, for they knew survival was impossible. They chose to die to create something larger than themselves, something that could not be destroyed by cannons or silenced by bayonets. They consciously chose to water the soil of Texas with their own blood so that a nation might be born from it. Their goal was not to win the battle, but to forge a legend that would win the war. What happened during those 13 days of siege in February and March of 1836 became more than history. It transformed into a foundational myth. It is a testament to how an act of military suicide can become a stroke of political genius. It is the story of an idealistic lawyer, a dying smuggler, and a famed bear hunter who, together, taught a dictator a terrible lesson about the power of martyrs. This is the story of how the most absolute defeat became the most resonant victory, encapsulated in 3 words that would become an immortal war cry and change the destiny of a continent. Commanding this desperate garrison was an unlikely triumvirate, a volatile mix of personalities that only the Texas frontier could have brought together. The official commander was Lieutenant Colonel William Barrett Travis, a 26-year-old lawyer, full of romantic idealism and a profound sense of honor, determined to make history or die trying. At his side, though confined to a cot by typhoid fever, was the legend-made man, Jim Bowie, a nationally famous brawler and smuggler, master of the knife that bore his name. And completing the trio, Davy Crockett, a former congressman from Tennessee and a national celebrity, an almost mythical figure who had arrived with a small group of volunteers to fight for Texas freedom. The force under their command was a microcosm of the rebellion itself, a motley collection of between 180 and 200 men. They were not a professional army. They were Texan colonists fighting for their homes, American volunteers from nearly every state who had come seeking adventure or land, and a brave contingent of Tejanos, Texans of Mexican descent, who opposed the centralist government of Mexico and fought for an independent Texas. What they lacked in military discipline and numbers, they made up for with a fierce independence and a deep conviction in their cause, the creation of a Republic of Texas, free from the authoritarian and dictatorial control of its southern neighbor. The giant looming over them was the embodiment of that power. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, President and Dictator of Mexico. He was a man consumed by arrogance, cruelty, and an insatiable thirst for glory. He saw himself as a Napoleonic figure, destined to forge an empire. The Texas Rebellion was not a simple political dispute to him, but a personal affront to his authority and to the glory of Mexico. He had not come to negotiate or pacify, he had come to crush, to annihilate all resistance, and to make such a terrible example of the Alamo that no one else in Texas would dare defy his power. To achieve this, Santa Anna had marched on Texas with a professional army of nearly 5,000 men. The assault force he specifically gathered to take the Alamo numbered some 1,500 of his best soldiers. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and outnumbered the defenders by a ratio of nearly 10 to 1. However, the fatal weakness of this Goliath was not military, but the ego of its commander. Santa Anna was too impatient for a long siege that would have starved out the defenders at low cost. He demanded a swift, bloody, and spectacular victory for his own glorification. His decision to take no prisoners, designed to terrify, would end up inspiring a resistance to the last breath. The battlefield itself was a testament to the defenders' desperate situation. The Alamo mission in San Antonio de Bexar was not designed as a military fortress. It was a sprawling 3-acre complex with a ruined church, a convent, and courtyards surrounded by adobe walls that were crumbling in places. The perimeter was too long, the walls too weak, and the defenders too few to mount a conventional defense. This structural weakness forced the defenders into a point-by-point struggle, turning the final battle into a series of brutal, hand-to-hand combats in every room and every corner. The ground guaranteed that their end would be intimate and bloody. It was in this adobe coffin, besieged and with no real hope of timely reinforcement, that William Travis made his most brilliant move. On February 24th, he took up pen and paper and wrote one of the most famous letters in American history. Addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, it declared his intention to never surrender or retreat. He described their situation and concluded with a sentence that would echo for eternity: victory or death. This letter was not truly a plea for help. It was a manifesto, the first page of the legend he was consciously writing with the ink of his own blood. To discover how these words became the spark that ignited a revolution, subscribe and activate notifications, because the last stand at the Alamo is about to begin. On February 23, 1836, Santa Anna's army appeared on the horizon of San Antonio a year earlier than the Texans had expected. The dictator's arrival was a complete surprise. He immediately sent a messenger to the Alamo demanding an unconditional and immediate surrender. William Travis's response was pure defiant theater. Instead of a verbal reply, he ordered a single, thunderous shot to be fired from the fortress's largest cannon, an 18-pounder. The message was unequivocal, a gesture of contempt that echoed across the plain. There would be no negotiations. There would be no surrender. The battle for the Alamo had begun with a roar of gunpowder and defiance. The next day, Santa Anna answered Travis's challenge with an equally symbolic but far more sinister gesture. He ordered a blood-red flag to be raised over the bell tower of the San Fernando Church in full view of the Alamo's defenders. In the military tradition of the time, the meaning of the red flag was universal and terrifying: no quarter. It was the promise that no prisoners would be taken, that every defender would be put to the sword. With this act, Santa Anna, in his arrogance, made a fatal psychological blunder. He eliminated any incentive the defenders might have had to surrender. Knowing that surrender meant execution, he gave them only one option: to fight to the death. Santa Anna's decision sealed the fate of everyone within the Alamo's walls. There was no longer any debate about whether to resist or attempt a desperate escape. Now, the only question was how to die. The siege continued for the next several days with an almost constant bombardment, weakening the walls and exhausting the defenders. But the spirit inside the fortress did not break. It hardened. Every man knew he was living his last days. The red flag did not terrorize them. It liberated them. Freed from the burden of hope, they could focus on their sole remaining purpose: to make the dictator pay a hellish price for his victory. On the night of March 5th, with the final Mexican assault imminent and knowing that dawn would bring the final battle, the most iconic moment of the Alamo legend was forged. The story goes that William Travis, aware that no man should be compelled to stay, gathered the garrison. He drew his officer's sword and traced a line in the dusty soil of the courtyard. In a firm voice, he explained the desperate situation and asked that all men willing to stay and die with him cross the line. It was the moment of truth, the final choice between the instinct for survival and the commitment to honor. The response was almost unanimous. One by one, the defenders, in solemn silence, crossed the line to join Travis. Men from all walks of life and from every corner of America committed to their common fate. According to legend, only one man, a French settler named Moses Rose, chose not to cross, and he would later escape over the wall, becoming the Alamo's sole coward and the primary narrator of this story. This act of collective choice transformed the garrison from a group of trapped soldiers into a brotherhood of willing martyrs, united in a death pact. The most poignant detail of this legendary moment was that of Jim Bowie. Lying on his cot, weakened by fever and too ill to stand, he watched the scene. When nearly everyone had crossed, he raised his voice and asked his friends to carry him across the line. 4 men lifted his cot and placed it alongside Travis and the others. The most feared fighter on the frontier, even on his deathbed, chose honor over surrender. With this act, the decision was made. The Alamo garrison would await the dawn, not as victims, but as a willing sacrifice on the altar of Texas freedom. Just before dawn on March 6th, the 13th day of the siege, the silence was broken by a chilling sound. From the Mexican ranks, the military bands began to play El Degüello. It was a brutal martial march, with no notes of hope or mercy, whose name literally translates to the slitting of the throat. It was the soundtrack of annihilation, the final signal that the no-quarter assault was about to begin. From 4 different directions, 1,500 of Santa Anna's best soldiers surged toward the Alamo's walls, shouting, "Viva Santa Anna!" The fighting was an inferno of unimaginable ferocity. The defenders, though outnumbered, were ready. Their cannons, loaded with grape shot, tore huge gaps in the Mexican assault columns. Their long rifles and muskets brought down hundreds of attackers in the pre-dawn darkness. For a time, the Texan fire was so intense that they repelled the first and second assault waves, piling the bodies of Mexican soldiers at the base of the walls. But the tide of men was simply too great. William Travis was one of the first to fall, struck by a bullet to the head as he directed the defense of the north wall, the fortress's weakest point. His early death did not stop the fight. The defenders continued to battle with the fury of men with nothing to lose. Finally, the Mexican soldiers managed to scale the walls at several points at once. The battle then moved inside the compound, becoming a series of savage, desperate fights, room by room, man to man, with knives, bayonets, and rifle butts. Jim Bowie, too weak to rise from his bed, was killed in his room in the convent, though legends claim he took several Mexican soldiers with him using his pistols and his famous knife. Davy Crockett and his small band of Tennessee volunteers made their last stand near the chapel, fighting until they were overwhelmed by numbers. Everywhere, the defenders sold their lives dearly, fighting until the last man was cut down. The battle, from the start of the assault to the final silence, lasted only 90 minutes. When the sun finally rose over the Alamo, it illuminated a scene of total carnage. The courtyard and rooms were covered with the dead and dying. The Mexican flag flew over the walls. The defense had been completely annihilated, just as Santa Anna had ordered. No prisoners were taken. A few men who surrendered or were captured at the end of the fight were summarily executed on the dictator's direct order. Santa Anna's victory was absolute. He had crushed the rebellion in San Antonio and made his terrible example. Yet, in his total victory, Santa Anna did not realize he had created something far more powerful than the small garrison he had just destroyed. He had not killed 200 rebels. He had given birth to 200 martyrs. The smoke rising from the funeral pyres where he burned the defenders' bodies was not a sign of his power, but a smoke signal that would carry the news of the sacrifice across Texas and all of America, igniting a fire of vengeance that would ultimately consume him and his army. The carnage at the Alamo was total for the defenders. Every one of the roughly 200 men who had defended the mission was killed. But Santa Anna's victory came at a horrific cost, far higher than he had ever anticipated. Although exact figures are disputed, it is estimated that the Mexican army suffered between 400 and 600 casualties, killed and wounded, during the 90-minute assault. To lose so many of his best soldiers to take a ruined fortress defended by a handful of rebels was a Pyrrhic victory that enraged Santa Anna and demoralized his troops. The price of glory had been terribly high. Though technically the victor of the battle, Santa Anna's ultimate fate as a commander in Texas was sealed at the Alamo. He won the battle but lost the war of perception in a catastrophic way. His cruelty, his refusal to take prisoners, and the massacre of men who had already become legendary figures like Davy Crockett did not terrorize the Texans. It unified them and gave them a sacred cause. Every decision he made at the Alamo, driven by his ego, became a nail in the coffin of his own campaign. He became the perfect villain against whom the entire population of Texas could unite. For the defenders, their fate was immortality. Santa Anna, in a final act of contempt, denied the Texans a Christian burial. He ordered their bodies to be stacked on huge pyres and burned. But this act, designed to erase their memory, had the opposite effect. The columns of smoke rising from the Alamo became a beacon, a visible sign of the sacrifice that had been made. The fire did not consume their legacy. It forged it, purifying it into the legend of heroism and defiance that would spread like wildfire across the land, igniting the hearts of thousands to continue the fight. The political and military impact of the fall of the Alamo was immediate and transformative. The news of the massacre, carried by the few non-combatant survivors, spread throughout Texas. The effect was not fear, but uncontrollable rage. The story of the sacrifice of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett galvanized a hitherto divided population of settlers. Suddenly, they had a common cause, a shared grievance, and a rallying cry. "Remember the Alamo" became the roar that united the volunteer armies, turning a disorganized rebellion into a determined revolution with a sacred purpose. The legend of the Alamo paid its strategic dividend just 46 days later. On April 21, 1836, at the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texan army, led by Sam Houston, met Santa Anna's army. Though still outnumbered, the Texans charged the Mexican lines during their afternoon siesta, screaming at the top of their lungs, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" The battle was a slaughter. In just 18 minutes, the Mexican army was completely destroyed. Santa Anna himself was captured the next day, and in exchange for his life, was forced to sign the treaties that guaranteed the independence of the Republic of Texas. Over time, the story of the Alamo transcended history books to become the founding myth of the state of Texas and a pillar of American mythology. It became the ultimate symbol of courage in the face of impossible odds, a story of men who chose death over submission. It represents the powerful idea that some principles, like liberty and self-determination, are worth the ultimate sacrifice. The Alamo is no longer just a place, it is an ideal, a reminder that sometimes one must be willing to lose everything to win it all. The battle has been immortalized in countless books, poems, and films, with each generation reinterpreting the story for its own purposes. While modern historians have added nuance to the legend, questioning motivations and separating myth from reality, the central power of the story remains intact. It continues to be a fundamental narrative about sacrifice, heroism, and the birth of an identity. The Alamo is a place where history and legend are so intertwined that they have become inseparable, creating one of the most enduring epics of the human spirit. After the battle, amidst the rubble and the charred bodies, Santa Anna, surveying his costly victory, addressed one of the few non-combatant survivors, the mayor of San Antonio, Jose Antonio Navarro. With a mix of curiosity and disdain, the dictator asked, "What were the Texans?" He sought to understand what kind of men had chosen such a useless annihilation. The mayor's reply was simple, direct, and profound. They were men who fought for their principles, General. Santa Anna, unfazed, retorted arrogantly, "I fight for mine as well." In that brief exchange lies the final and most powerful irony of the entire Alamo saga. Santa Anna believed that by annihilating his enemies, he had asserted the supremacy of his own principles of centralized order and absolute power. But what he actually achieved was the exact opposite. By slaughtering the defenders of the Alamo, he did not destroy their principles. He immortalized them. He turned their ideas about liberty into a sacred gospel, sealed with the blood of martyrs. And in doing so, he guaranteed the final, humiliating destruction of everything he stood for, proving that you can kill men, but you cannot kill an idea for which men are willing to die.